Hello, hello, welcome. Come one, come all. We're very happy to have you. Say hello in the comments section right now. You guys are encouraged to use the comments section liberally to ask questions, to answer questions, because we're going to be seeing some actual practice questions in this session. And it's more fun if everybody is in on it, essentially. So welcome to EA 101. I am Ryan Starr, and it is nice to see you all. All right. Making sure everybody is in. As you stream in, let us know where you're joining us from today and take a crack at this problem. Let's just hit the ground running. This problem is the GMAT problem, as you see there. And of course, as you will likely know, the EA is made by the GMAT people. They use a lot of the same problems. This is what an EA problem will likely look like. Take some time with it as you stream in. See if you can answer it. If you feel like you've got an answer, put it into the chat window and let us know where you're at with this thing. Welcome those of you just joining. We are starting this EA 101 presentation with a problem out the gates. And we're in a race to see who can get an answer in that chat window first. Welcome, by the way, to our friend from India. And also, you've won the race to put something in the comments window first, which is a huge win. Keep doing that. Remember, we are racing to see who can find an answer to this question. Very EA-like question, one that would be incredibly at home on the quant section. And one thing to keep in mind as you're doing this, for those of you new to the EA especially, you don't get a calculator on this. And this would be a pretty doable problem with a calculator or with Excel at your disposal. But what do we do with it without those tools? And what we're going to talk about in this session is the fact that there are some classic ways to approach problems like this, especially, as I'm sure many of you are thinking, algebraic approaches. Use a formula, do the calculations, solve for x, that sort of thing. There are also other kinds of approaches, numerical approaches to solving a problem in some cases, and conceptual, or what you might call logical approaches, putting the stuff together in the right way, putting the right kind of stuff together to make sense of it, use the answer choices to your advantage, and things like that. So getting into this problem together. The classic way to do this problem is, well, they're asking for an average annual salary. And the average of something is going to tend to be the sum of all those things divided by how many things you have, right? You've got 6 salaries accounted for here. And so we'd have to sum up all those 6 salaries and divide by 6. Now, that can be a lot. There are, pretty big numbers there, but it's not prohibitive. Really, it's going to be the dividing by 6 that gets us probably to spend the most time on it. But we can do that. We've got 2 14,000 salaries. By the way, well done, Abdul. Abdul wins the race. You got 1 16,000 salary, and you've got 3 $17,000 salaries. And some, calculations go into it. You get the total amount of salary and you divide that thing by 6. It's going to be 28,000 plus 16,000 brings you to 44,000 plus 3 times 17 is 51. So another 51,000, all of which brings you to about 95,000 on top. And dividing by 6 is pretty doable, especially if you're comfortable with the long division thing. You set up the 95,000, divide the 6 into the 9, and so on and so forth. And eventually it comes out to around 15,800. But the question becomes, how else might we do this problem without going through the traditional motions, which are not prohibitive? You could probably get this done in 2 to 3 minutes, unless you're very good at back of the envelope arithmetic. Again, you don't have a calculator for this, so you'd have to be doing a lot of these calculations by hand. All right. Rohan's giving us something really, really good in the comments. Absolutely. The 10,000 is common to everything, so we don't necessarily have to worry about it. What we have to worry about, we see the 10,000 in all the answer choices, in all the salaries. What we have to worry about is more what you might think of as the units digit, the thousands really digit, the 4, the 6, the 7, and the 7. Makes our life way easier just to average those numbers, right? 2 4s, 1 6, 3 7s, divide that by 6, and figure out how many thousands we have over and above the 10,000. That's a brilliant approach. Very, very logical. And the more you can lean on logic in this test, the more it cuts down on the math you have to do, right? Absolutely. I love that approach, by the way. Well done, Rohan. Another thing, you've got some 14,000s, some 17,000s that offset each other, right? And a 16,000 just annoyingly in the middle there. You can kind of do it by weighted averages. You can say, okay, if it were 3 14,000s and 3 17,000s, the average would be 15,500, right in the middle of those two extremes. All right. But we know it's not 3 14,000s and 3 17,000s, because instead of one of those 14,000s, we've got a 16,000. And that means it can't be 15,500, nor can it be lower. It needs to be higher than 15,500. But given that that last number is only 16,000, it can't bring the average too high over 15,500. The average is still going to be between the 15,500 we would have if it were 3 14,000s and 3 17,000s and the 16,000 that it actually is. So that's 3 different ways to get to C as an answer here. All right. 3 different ways for one problem. The message I want to convey to you today, and there's going to be a lot we talk about in terms of getting to know the test and how to study well, but the message I want to convey to you today, especially as we look at problems, is there's more than one way to do basically every problem in the quant section of the EA. And as you're studying for the test, the best thing you can do is explore different approaches to the same problem. You will get better faster by doing one problem 2 different ways than by doing 2 different problems one way each, especially at a certain point, okay? In the beginning, it feels like you want to see a little bit of everything, and that's pretty fair in early study times. But as you move into the middle of your study period, and certainly toward the end, you get a lot more out of doing individual problems in more than one way. Okay. Great job, Abdul, Rohan. Loving it. Everybody else, get in on this action. Be in the comments. We love to hear from you. And I will respond to questions all the time because truth time, I love questions. I live for them. All right. Let's talk about these things. This is our presentation. What's on the EA for anybody totally new to the EA coming here saying, I want EA 101. Haven't really done anything with the EA, was looking to figure out what it's about. We've got you covered. We'll talk quickly about what the EA is about, though there are other videos, including one I did last year, that talks in depth about how the EA is set up and scored and things like that. Okay, so we'll go through that quickly this time and instead talk more heavily this time about how to get the most out of your preparation and, of course, respond to questions that you send in. So send them in. I am always keeping an eye on the comments. EA exam basics, score is good for 5 years. You can take it 4 times, and this is key. The internet is a bit outdated on this because it wasn't always the case. It used to be that you could only take the EA twice. Then they added the online version of the exam and one more attempt with that online version of the exam. So you could take it twice in person and once online. Now you can take it twice in person and twice online. You can't take it 4 times in person. You can't take it 4 times online, but you can take it 4 times total if you break it down in this 2-and-2 way. Every time you take it, though, depending on where you're at, it should cost you about $350 US. In some places, there is, say, VAT added on top of that. In some places, there's a price in local currency, but in most places, it's $350 US in converted to whatever currency is local for you. Under standard timing, it's going to take 90 minutes to get through the exam. There's no breaks. You just kind of run straight through 3 30-minute sections, all right? Or 3 30-minute pairs of sections, you might think of it as. However, if you have a history of receiving accommodations on exams in university or anything like that, you can apply for and often get 50% extra time or even 100% extra time to get through the exam. You can also sometimes get a break period or any other accommodation that you might require. Reach out to the GMAT people for those things, and they are, as the name suggests, pretty accommodating about those things, okay? EA is graded on a scale of 126 to 174, and typically you're aiming for 150 plus for an executive program, with some of the maybe top-tier executive programs here in the US requiring a little bit more. And if you're applying to a full-time program, usually you want to aim for the mid-150s or beyond. Part-time programs, somewhere in between those two. Often 153 is the number you see people wanting you to get. We'll talk about where those scores come from in a minute. But rules. As we just said, in looking at that quant question, there's no calculator on the quant. One of the things about this exam is it's not trying to be a math test. It's trying to be a reasoning test that happens to use math, but also has a verbal section and happens to use grammar, happens to use charts and tables and graphs and other things, okay? There's no calculator on the quant section. There is a calculator available to you in the integrated reasoning section. And for anybody who's like, the what now? We're going to see that in just a minute. All right. Results are going to be available to you immediately after the test if you're taking it in person in a test center. But if you take it online, you're going to have to wait a few days for those results. The vast majority of people end up waiting 3 to 4 days, but they reserve the right, and they'll tell you this in their official materials, to make you wait up to 7 days for your exam results if you've taken it online. I've only ever heard of one person who had to wait that long. I'm sure you can find plenty of people on the internet who have had to wait that long, and maybe even some of you have had to. For my part, when I took the EA online, they made me wait about 2 days to get my results. Okay. Business schools are going to consider your highest reported score, and you have some control over which scores you report to business schools. This is not exactly the same as, for anybody who's familiar, GMAT rules that basically just keep all your scores on a report as kind of a permanent running record of your GMAT successes and failings. The EA gives you a little bit more control over which scores you send to which schools, okay? At the test center, question comes from Bumpsy, do they provide a whiteboard? Not a whiteboard as such. So as you may have heard, if you're taking the test online, you can, at your own expense, purchase a whiteboard no bigger than 12 by 20 inches or 30 by 50 centimeters. If you go in person to take the exam, they don't give you a whiteboard as such. What they instead give you is usually pad, sometimes at some centers just a single sheet at a time, but usually a pad of 5 or 6 laminated, what we call here legal sized sheets of graph paper. All right, legal size meaning not A4, not 8.5 by 11 inches, but a bit longer than what you'd have as normal paper. It's spiral bound on one side. It's usually 5 or 6 sheets, and they give you a fine felt tipped pen to write on it with. It feels a bit like pen and paper, especially because you can't really erase the marks you've made. You just kind of have to keep going. Whereas if you're taking it online on a whiteboard, you're going to have to be erasing the whiteboard between every question or a couple of questions. Okay, so not exactly a whiteboard, but they do give you some sort of scratch surface to do your calculations on, which of course they have to do because you can't use a calculator on the quant section, and it would be very unfair to make you do all of that quant stuff without any sort of ability to write anything down. Okay, so just logistically a bit different, but they do give you a scratch paper writing surface. Great question. Keep those coming. All right, now as to what's on the test. You know what? Honestly, they may be at some centers providing a whiteboard now. Like I said, it kind of used to be that the default was a pad. And then I've had more people saying that at test centers, they were only given one sheet of paper, though that's still a minority of students. And so if you're reading on GMAT Club that some people found when they went to the test center, they were just given a whiteboard, it may be that the exam makers are trying to bring the online experience more in line with the test center experience so that it can't necessarily be said that there's an unfair advantage to one group of test takers or another. What I would assume then, especially given what's happened with the pads versus individual sheets of paper, is it's going to be a test center by test center thing. And the best thing to do is contact the test center you've got it scheduled at ahead of time and just ask them what they do. And if you worry that that's going to be an impediment for you and you really want, say, the pad of paper or something like that, you can always very freely reschedule the exam. In fact, rescheduling the EA is literally free of charge, and it can be done up until about 1 or 2 days before your exam is scheduled. So if you find out that the test center you scheduled it at doesn't even do the whiteboard and you want it, or doesn't do the pad and that's what you want, definitely reschedule that exam for a place that does. And you can definitely get in touch with the exam centers and ask them what their policy is. All right. Also, thanks for letting me know that, because I had not heard that necessarily from any of my students yet. But as I say, I trust the people on GMAT Club, and it may be a change that they are slow rolling out there. Yeah, exactly. Usually with the pad, it's okay because they give you so many sheets that you're never going to use it all. It's kind of when they give you just the one sheet of scratch paper that it's not the best, because you fill that up pretty quickly. You can always request more, even if they give you a whole pad. If you fill up that pad, you can simply request another pad and they will give it to you, but it takes some time. And again, you don't really have a break in that whole thing so that you can kind of do it without interfering with your section. It ends up being that, you know, as you're in the middle of a section and dealing with questions, you also have to kind of raise your hand, get them to come in and say, hey, I've used my pad, could I get a new one? And have them bring it to you. So not the greatest system in the world, and it would be nice if they're giving you the whiteboard. That may also be a good reason to take the exam online rather than in person if you strongly prefer the whiteboard thing. All right. And again, just because there's outdated information floating around on the internet, it used to be that the online exam only had an on-screen whiteboard, but now they allow you to use a physical whiteboard, and thank goodness. Okay. Great question. And again, keep them coming. So the test is 3 sections, but it ends up playing out more like 6 sections, as we'll talk about in a second. The scoring for each section is on a scale of 2 to 18 points. And your overall score, the one we talked about, you know, from 126 to 174 that you're trying to get to a 150 or 155 plus on, comes from basically 120 baseline points plus your IR score, plus your verbal score, plus your quant score. It is worth saying that most schools are looking most carefully at your quant score. That's the score that gets scrutinized. When you're studying, you want to make sure that quant is going pretty well. Okay. No breaks again if you're under standard timing. And as we've already said, it's available in person or online. There have been a number of full-time MBA programs accepting EA test scores, and it seems more and more. And to explain the shift and schools' inclination toward the EA, It can be like, I don't want to necessarily speak for the schools, but what I've seen over the years is that schools were once kind of totally beholden to the GMAT, especially for full-time admissions, right? But schools have started expanding the palette of tests that they allow applicants to take. So that started with the GRE about a decade ago. The GRE started coming into currency with a lot of major business schools. And over the last couple of years, it started even more with the EA. Now, why is this happening? There could be a couple of reasons, but what seems to be the case, especially given some things that have happened during the pandemic, for instance, that some of the more prominent schools have gone test optional, at least temporarily during the pandemic and such, is schools have gotten better and better over the years at determining a candidate's likelihood of success using metrics other than just the test scores, right? Schools used to really rely on the test scores because good test scores were meant to be correlated with good success in programs, but they've seen that correlation losing some validity over years, that actually good test scores seem to be correlated more strongly to success in the first year of a program, but not necessarily to success or even completion rate in the overall program, which means schools seem to be moving a bit away from tests. They also know that tests end up being a big bother for students. Okay, so given that schools have found ways other than tests to judge a candidate's likelihood of success, which is all they're really looking for in judging your application, they're happy to move away from tests overall. The EA kind of offers them a step down in that regard because it's still testing all the same things as the GMAT, but it's a much less intense exam for the test takers, which makes it a much friendlier applicant experience. Applicant wins on that one. And the EA scores, at least historically, have not been reported to ranking institutions the way that GMAT scores have to be. Like if you've looked at school rankings, you've probably noticed that there's a 20th to 80th percentile ranking for the GMAT scores for any given school. And that determines a little bit about the school's place in the top 10 or top 20 or things like that. The EA scores don't really factor into that yet. And so the EA scores have given schools a way to accept applicants who maybe are not the strongest test takers without necessarily worrying about protecting their average score for admitted candidates and therefore their rankings. Those are some of the major factors at play. Maybe they've also just seen that the EA is a quality exam and helps to predict success in business school just as well as the GMAT and GRE, though I think they're still kind of gathering data on that because, of course, it's only been a little while that some schools have started accepting the EA for full-time admissions. You can do a Google search online. The EA's own page has a pretty up-to-date list about which schools and especially which programs at which schools accept the EA. You can see which schools do it for full-time, but most prominently right now, it's Columbia, NYU, Georgetown, and Duke in the University of Virginia. Those are like the major schools that people have noticed are accepting the EA for full-time admissions. A bigger roster of schools is accepting the EA for part-time programs, and the biggest roster of schools is accepting the EA for executive programs. However, not all executive programs do accept the EA, so you really want to be sure that your school, the program you want to get into, does accept the EA. And if it does, the EA tends to be the best test to take for it. They're not going to look down on you for taking the EA. Really, it gives them an excuse to say, okay, test score, good enough. Let's focus on other aspects of your application. Sorry about the barking dog. YouTube videos and barking dogs. Do they mix? I don't know. All right. Said that the test was 3 sections, but actually it feels more like 6 sections. And that's because each one of these sections is broken down into 2 halves. Between each half, you get a review screen in which you get to look at what you've done on the half. Have you answered every question or left some incomplete to go back to? And have you marked any to specifically say you want to go back to them? The practice tests you might take and the actual exam both have a bookmarking feature so that you can mark which ones you want to return to if you've kind of guessed on one and you say, I'll come back to that if I have time, but it's not really worth my time right now. Use that feature liberally. One of the huge advantages the EA has over the GMAT is that you can move back and forth within each of these kind of subsections of the test. So for the first 6 IR questions, move back and forth. Once you finalize that half section on the review screen, you're moving on to this one and you never get to go back to that one. So there is some finality to it, but it's not the way the GMAT is, in which once you've answered a single question, that question's final and you're never seeing it again. You get to move back and forth, and you get to prioritize and deprioritize questions based on how difficult or easy they look. Okay. Depending on how you do on that, you're going to get a harder, medium, or easier second section. And again, at the end of that, you get a review screen in which you can look back over the questions you've done for that section. Now, one thing to be really clear on is, even if you never get to that second review screen and say, all right, I want to finalize this second half section, you'll still get credit for all the questions that you have marked an answer on. Even if you're on question 12 and you've marked an answer, but you don't click next, you're going to get credit, assuming that answer is correct, for that question. Okay. So don't feel as though if I don't get to that review screen and finalize the thing before the time runs out, I'm toast. You're not at all toast. All right. But by that same token, there's no advantage to leaving questions blank on this exam. If you do see that you're running out of time, and on the real test, you get a 5-minute warning before that happens, make sure you have some answer marked in for everything, just so on the off chance you might get 1 or even 2 questions right, depending on the section, and boost your score a little bit. That's part of good test taking strategy. All right. It should also be noted that these 30 minutes that you have are for both of these subsections. So on the test, this can be a little confusing. It'll say you're on section or stage or subsection. They keep changing the words, 1 of 6. And it'll give you a 30-minute timer. And it's tempting to think, I got 30 minutes for section 1 of 6. But no, you got 30 minutes for the first 2 of the 6 sections. You've got 30 minutes for the next 2 of the 6 sections. And you've got 30 minutes for the final 2 of 6 sections, sections 5 and 6. Okay. So budget your time well, because the test will let you spend all 30 minutes in the first section of the 2 that make up the IR section, for instance, but you shouldn't. You should move yourself on when you have about 15, 14, maybe if you're pushing it, 13 minutes left, assuming you're on standard timing. Okay. The one other thing to say about the test here, just in terms of structure, and you might gather this from this complicated arrow system, is your performance in IR dictates your starting difficulty in verbal and your starting difficulty in quant. Okay. And so does that really mean anything for your score potential in verbal or quant? No. If you do really badly in IR, you can still go on to get a perfect score in verbal and a perfect score in quant. I've seen it happen. All right. And if you do really well in IR, that doesn't mean, oh, I've got a really hard verbal and quant section, so I'm going to get a bad score either. The truth of the test is, the harder the questions you're getting, the more leeway you have to get those questions wrong and still not have it hurt your score out of 18 points all that much. Okay. The harder the question you get wrong, the less it hurts your score. The easier the question you get wrong, the more it hurts your score. So you kind of want to get the hard sections here, because that means you don't have to get to every question to end up coming away with a good score. In fact, if you play your cards right in verbal and quant, you can miss up to half of the questions and still come away with a score of 10 on the section, which is going to be good enough for most executive programs. All right. But if you miss something more like 5 in those sections, you could very easily get an 11 or even up to a 12 for that performance if those 5 questions you miss happen to be pretty hard. Okay. So that if you get, say, the whole first half right, qualify for the hard second half and miss 5 of those questions, there is a very good chance that you come away with that from that with a score of 12, which is a great score, especially for executive programs. But once you start getting 12s in the sections, your score is also starting to be good enough for full-time admissions. Okay. That's what you are looking for. Ideally, you'd be missing maybe 3 or 4 per section, especially in the quant and verbal, because that's going to pretty much guarantee that you get a 12 or better as your score. In the IR section, it's probably a bit less, but get 3 questions wrong, and there's a good chance you're coming away from that with a 12 or an 11. Get 4 questions wrong, you're still likely guaranteed to get a double-digit score, especially if, again, those 4 questions are hard questions. Okay. Mumsy, I'm seeing your question, or your comment at least, and I agree. You know what? Just personally for me, the IR section has always been the hardest, especially from a time perspective. I remember on my last exam that I took online, I got that 5-minute warning that I talked about when I was on question 10. And that's not a bad place to be, but I just started question 10. And on IR, you have about 2.5 minutes per problem if you're under standard timing, right? And so I'm on question 10, just started it, meaning I've got 3 questions left to do, 10, 11, and 12 in 2 questions worth of time, right? Tight spot. What I did at that point, and what I would recommend that all of you do at that point, if not earlier in the section, is I abandoned question 10 right away, looked at question 11 and looked at question 12, just to see what I was getting myself into in these last 3 questions. And I prioritized question 11 first because it looked the easiest, then question 10 because it looked next easiest, and finally question 12. And I barely got it done in time, but I did get it done in time. You're going to be under a pretty strict time constraint. It's going to feel like bad timing in all the sections, but I agree with Bumsy. It feels, to me at least, like IR is the tightest time. And so prioritize. Make sure that you are not just spending all the time on whatever questions in front of you. Some of the questions in IR are going to be much more time consuming than other questions. And if you get sucked into those questions and spend 5 or 6 minutes on them, that might cost you 2 questions down the line that you can't afford to give up. It's better to have done those 2 questions and to have just guessed on that 5 or 6 minute question. So one of the things that you are looking to do as you're studying for this exam, and especially as you're taking practice tests, is figure out which question types tend to take more of your time so that you know on the real exam, part of your strategy is going to be when those questions pop up, guess on them right away, bookmark them so you can come back to them later if you have time, and basically don't let them blow up your section. Just go on to what are going to be easier questions for you. Because remember, the hardest questions for you, the most time-consuming questions for you, are probably also what the test is going to consider the hardest questions, right? Those are going to be the questions more people are missing. And that means that even if you never get back to it and you've just put in a random guess, it's probably not going to cost you that much, right? And indeed, multi-source reasoning can be very, very difficult. I totally agree with that. Multi-source reasoning is part of the integrated reasoning section. And indeed, let's look at that integrated reasoning section a little bit now because we're talking about it. There are 4 types of questions on the integrated reasoning section, or 4 types of prompts, let's say. Tables, all right, which a lot of people can find pretty straightforward, though there's usually going to be one that's more math-based or finding stuff-based, and then one that's more logic-based. And I'll say the logic-based table tends to be pretty time-consuming, especially compared to the math-based one, all right? And then there are going to be 3 multi-source reasoning questions. This is the one that Vamsi is just referring to. These come always in the first half of the IR section, which means even though they're going to be difficult and they're going to be time consuming, it is still, strategically speaking, pretty necessary to do those questions to the best of your ability. Okay. And that's actually what cost me all the time on my last exam. I remember my first 3 questions were the multi-source reasoning. And as we said, it should be about 2.5 minutes per question. But I took, I think, a full 11 minutes on those questions, on those 3 questions. So that's why I found myself with only 5 minutes to spend on my last 3 questions, right? You need to get MSR right by all means necessary, basically. If it takes extra time, spend that extra time because MSR is very important. And indeed, thank you, GMAT Club. We do offer a comprehensive course on this, and check out GMAT Club's own practice test. If you're wondering, like, what do these questions look like in practice? GMAT Club does a free EA practice test, and they're one of the only ones to do it at the moment that can give you a sense of what the format's like and indeed how difficult some of these questions can be. I will say GMAT Club's practice test, especially in the MSR, from what I've seen, is actually really difficult, and it may not be that difficult on your actual test, but it may be. It's kind of down to luck of the draw more than anything else. All right. Alongside those table questions, 2 table questions, and the 3 MSR questions, on the IR section, you're also going to have some graph questions, usually about 3 of them, and some 2-part analysis questions. And again, the graph questions and the 2-part analysis questions kind of break down the way the table questions do, in that there's usually going to be a logic type graph question, a logic type 2-part analysis question. That one especially can be time consuming. Okay. There's usually going to be a more math-based graph question and 2 math-based 2-part questions. All right. So the IR section has a lot of math on it, but also a lot of logic and a lot of reading and verbal stuff going on. In fact, one of the hardest parts about the IR section is the verbal stuff. They very deliberately construct the information, the names of things, to make it easy to misread stuff. You see, final score in a question, and then there's in the table a column for final exam score and final score. And it's really easy to read final score, but then go to the column for final exam score by sheer accident. And you kick yourself for those mistakes, but those mistakes are built in to how the IR section works. Okay, they're built in. Other stuff on the exam. So that's your IR section. Verbal section comes next. Gonna have 14 problems, 3 question types on it. The same 3 question types that are on the GMAT, for those of you who are familiar. Sentence correction, bit more prominent than the other 2 types. Reading comprehension and critical reasoning. Usually it's going to be 6 SC for reading comprehension, for critical reasoning. And we're going to take a look at what these question types look like in a little bit, just in case you've never seen them before, maybe even get tangled up with 1 or 2 of them. But just kind of round out our structure talk. Quant section, also 14 problems, breaks down into 2 question types. Problem solving, just like the type we opened with, gives you some information up top, gives you 5 answer choices to choose from down below. They can be 5 numbers, as we saw there, $5 figures. They could also be 5 variable expression, 5 ratios, percents, etc. But you just choose the right one of the 5. And indeed, the entire exam is multiple choice. You never have to write in your own answer or anything like that. You never have to select more than 1 answer kind of at a time, though the IR section has some weird formats in which you do have to answer kind of 2 questions at once or even 3 questions at once. But you're never going to have to select like B and C for a quant or a verbal question or anything like that. There's, on the quant and verbal especially, 1 right answer, 4 wrong answers every single time, 5 answer choices. Okay. Problem solving, again, what we saw earlier. Data sufficiency is the question type that a lot of people worry about and struggle most with on the quant section. And so we're going to look at a data sufficiency question later too, just to get a sense of what those question types are asking for and how you might approach them. Okay. Now, last thing to say about what's on the test. We've talked about the logistics of it. We've talked about the structure of it. We've talked about the structure within each section and the question types. But what about the content? What do we need to know to do well on this test? All right. On the left side, quant and IR section will rely heavily on these kinds of concepts. Some are more prevalent in the quant section, for instance, exponents and roots. Much more in the quant section, much less prominent in the IR section. Linear equations, though, can show up in both. Inequalities, to some degree, can show up in both, but show up more in the quant section. Of those 3 categories, linear equations will be the most important. Okay. But of all of these things, the most important for both quant and IR will be those 3 right there and these 2 down there, with a bit of a shout out to linear equations. All right. If you're saying, all right, I need to take this test soon, I don't have time to study everything. What are like the really, really important things? Percents, fractions, ratios, statistics, and just some comfort with algebraic translations and word problems in general. All right. All of these other things are fair game. They show up. You're likely to get 1 positives, negatives question per test. All right. You're pretty likely to get 1 rates and work, at least 1 inequality, and probably like 1 or 2 exponent or roots problems. But between the IR and the quant section, you're going to get a couple of percents and a couple of ratio problems. The test relies heavily on a pretty deep knowledge of fractions and how they work, not just how to add them and subtract them and multiply them and divide them, but also how to set up word problems with fractions, how to know whether a fraction is going to be bigger than another fraction by like changes in the numerator and changes in the denominator. A lot of conceptual stuff tested with fractions and ratios, especially on the actual exam. This shows up a lot on the practice exams too. On the verbal side, in the sentence correction, you're going to need to know about sentence structure, run-ons, fragments, clauses, stuff like that. Meaning gets tested heavily. modifiers, parallels, and comparisons, and idioms as well, though idioms are pretty hard to study for. And you can see the rest of it there. This is the stuff to really master. Now, schools tend to look least at the verbal section, most at the quant section, and IR is usually somewhere in between. So again, if you're studying for this test and looking to get the best bang for your buck, make sure that you study those quant topics and that you're solid on them. If you've got a slightly lower score in verbal, even if it's down in like the 9 or 10 range, and even if you're applying to a full-time program with it, if you've got a quant score in the teens and an IR score around 12 or higher, you're pretty solid. Okay. Coordinate geometry is going to come up every now and again. It's fair game, though applied geometry like shapes and stuff like that usually should not be coming up. Coordinate geometry can come up. I've not seen a coordinate geometry question on either of my official exams that I've taken, but I've definitely had some students see a coordinate plane problem every now and then. Coordinate geometry is kind of on the same level as probability and combinatorics, right? So we didn't list every topic here that could be tested. We listed the topics that are pretty commonly tested here, and coordinate geometry is not one of them. You're getting probably 0 on any given exam, maybe 1. Same with combinatorics, combinations and permutations. Same with probability. I know those areas worry a lot of people. They don't come up a huge amount. One area, though, that does come up on some tests, and that isn't really totally well covered here, overlapping sets. All right. So, those problems that say, of the people in a certain town, some number own cats and some people don't. And also of those same people, some people have a pilot's license and some don't. How many people have a pilot's license and own a cat? Those kinds of problems, they come up about roughly as often, I would say, as rates and work problems, which is to say there's a good chance you get 1 on your test. You might see 0, but 1 is probably a bit more common than 0. Probability, combinatorics, coordinate geometry, they're more on the 0 side, but they can come up. All right. Great question. And you guys, don't let Vamsi alone ask questions. Everybody's welcome to, but Vamsi, keep those questions coming because I love them. Yeah, that's exactly it. And, not that every student I've ever had reports to me what they end up seeing on the exam, to be fair. But I've only explicitly had 2 students say, I saw a coordinate geometry question. That's a little weird. And there's a chance it's just experimental when it shows up. But it is considered by the test fair game because even though some people will consider it coordinate geometry, I think the test makers consider it algebra that happens to play out on a coordinate plane, especially if they're not, say, putting a triangle on it or putting a circle on it and asking you a question like that, but rather asking you about coordinates, about slopes, about intersections between lines, parallel lines, perpendicular lines. It seems the test maker considers that fair game, but it is definitely not a commonly tested area. All right. Great question. And definitely keep these questions coming. All right. Let's get into a little bit more depth with this now and just talk about what some of the verbal questions look like, what some of the quant questions look like, so that you have a sense of not only what they look like, but roughly what you want to do with them methodically so that you can get, if you're just studying, get started with a bit of a running start. Hit the ground running, as they say. All right. We already looked at the kinds of problems on the IR section. And honestly, there's a lot of detail to go into about how those different problems play out. Like math-based table questions don't play out the same as logic-based table questions. Though I will say one of the best pieces of advice I can give you on the IR section is just remember that there's a calculator there. It's sometimes tucked away as a little icon in the corner, but the number of people I've seen just forget that they have access to a calculator and so waste time on doing calculations by hand because they're used to doing it from the quant section is beyond count at this point. I don't want that to happen to you. Remember that you have a calculator and you're going to save yourself some trouble. Let's get in with a little more depth to the kinds of questions you see on the verbal section, the kinds of questions you see on the quant section, and study things, what you should be doing as you study for this exam. All right. Let's start with this. This right here is a sentence correction question for anybody who's never seen any of the verbal sections before. Check it out. It's a sentence correction question. You'll know it because starts with just a sentence. It's only going to be one sentence. It's never going to be two sentences or anything like that. Just a single sentence. Part of that sentence will be underlined. It could be as little as a single word, though that's very, very rare. It could be as much as the entire sentence, and that's a bit less rare. I would expect maybe one question on any given EA to be a full sentence underline or a nearly full sentence underline. Most of the time, though, it's somewhere in between those two extremes, as in this case, for instance. This is a pretty typical underlined portion. And what you're going to get is 5 answer choices that, in the case of A, replicate the underlined portion, and in the case of B, C, D, and E, offer changes to that underlined portion. You have to choose the one that works best. Now, this is kind of a grammatical question type. One of the ways that you determine what works best in sentence correction is which one or which ones are grammatically correct. But as the questions get harder, you might find that a couple of answers are grammatically correct. And so it goes beyond just grammar in the same way that the quant section goes beyond just algebra skills, right? Math. It is a reasoning test. And one of the other things you're considering is meaning. So for instance, looking at this one, you might have looked at these answer choices, and the method is compare them to each other, by the way. Don't read each answer choice all the way through horizontally, and certainly don't read each answer choice into the sentence, because that ends up taking too much time and doesn't even yield great results. Rather, look at these answer choices in the sense of what's different about them. Notice that some have both to and others have to both, right? Some have prevent them. Some have these stores. And just take one difference at a time. Consider it and think about which one's going to be right from a grammatical perspective, from a clarity of meaning perspective, and barring those two things, from just a word choice, idiom, concision even perspective. All right. By the way, Bumsy, you're totally right with your quick guess. That's exactly right. You don't have to start at the beginning of the answer choices. You don't have to even start at the end of the answer choices, but there's always going to be a difference at the beginning of the answer choices, and there's always going to be a difference at the end of the answer choices. There will often be differences in the middle, like and to versus and prevent versus comma preventing, I suppose, right? You can start anywhere you think you're going to make your best move, okay? C ends up being right. For instance, them and these stores, that's not going to be necessarily a grammatical issue here. All right. Turns out that both of these will be grammatically correct. The issue ends up being more that them refers to salespeople. All right. The way this structure is set up, we've got a parallel structure because of the and. And if we say to allocate salespeople to specific stores and to prevent them from competing internally for staffers, by position, them wants to, nice job, Navrash, them wants to call back to salespeople. That's not grammatically wrong, but given the context of the sentence, it makes less sense to suppose that salespeople would be competing internally for staffers by offering wage hikes at particular locations. Salespeople probably are the staffers, especially at stores, right? Salespeople are the staffers. And so we don't want to prevent the salespeople from competing internally for staffers. They are the staffers. We'd want to prevent the stores from competing internally for staffers. What you need to know to do sentence correction well is that grammar is one tool at your disposal. You need to know grammatically the way the sentence is written, what it means, but you also need to weigh that against what was likely the intended meaning of the sentence. Grammatically, this them means salespeople. The intended meaning of the sentence was probably more along the lines of prevent the stores themselves, the locations, from competing internally in the company among each other for salespeople, for staffers. And so these stores is going to be a clearer way to do that. And then you're down to B and C, and you can decide B versus C based on the other stuff at play here. For instance, of course, both to allocate, which is what we have in both of these beginnings, versus and prevent and to prevent. This is an issue called parallelism, one of the prominent issues, as we saw on our other slide of prominent issues in sentence correction. And the general rule is if you have a two-part setup, both X and Y, either X or Y, make sure that the X part and the Y part look pretty alike. To allocate and to prevent, that's a really, really good match, right? To allocate and just prevent, not such a good match there, right? Though, to be fair, to both allocate and prevent, even though I'm highlighting it in red, would have been okay. D is good from a parallelism point of view. One of the things you find with parallelism is you can often do it two different ways and still be successful. But D, of course, has that pronoun issue with the them. Vamsi, I think, honestly, the right way to go through sentence correction is to play to your strengths, right? And if you find that you can make better eliminations based on meaning and then bring it home with some grammar, that's the way for you to go. If you find, anybody out there, that grammar is your stronger suit and meaning is a little bit tougher, a little bit more shadowy, start with grammar. You may find you don't even need to use meaning that way. And similarly, Vamsi, I'm sure you find sometimes you can do it on meaning alone and you never really have to resort to grammar. Always play to your strengths. Even within the grammatical issues, you'll probably find that certain grammatical issues really resonate and other ones are a bit tougher, right? So even within the grammatical issues, you should play to your strengths. And that's why you don't want to just start with whatever first difference you encounter in the answer choices. Shop around a little bit. Find the difference that plays best to your strengths in sentence correction, and you're going to be doing the best job possible. All right. And indeed, this one is C as in cool. I'm kind of giving us a color smorgasbord here. But there we go. Well done. Those of you who answered, well done. Those of you who didn't answer, don't hesitate. Just answer. It's cool. It'll just live in the comments on this video forever, but nobody will know. It's just between you and me. All right. This, by contrast, is an example of critical reasoning. All right. Oh, great question, Mumsy. The EA, by and large, skews a little bit easier than the GMAT, and I'd say nowhere is that more true than in the quant section. I would say even if you're doing really well in the quant section, you will get one or two questions that would probably be considered by GMAT a 700 to 800 level question. The rest will be 500 to 600, 600 to 700 level questions. And again, I want to stress that's even if you're doing really well. On the first time I took the exam, I got to my second half of quant and I was like, I'm doing pretty well on quant, right? I usually do okay, one would hope. Get to that second half, and the first question was a data sufficiency question, and it was easy. All right. It was at best 500 to 600, and that's if I'm being generous. It was honestly a fairly easy question, but it threw me for a loop because I was like, one, did I do something wrong in the first half and I'm actually not doing as well as I thought? No, it turned out I was doing fine. I ended up getting a good score in that quant section. But the other thought was, am I just missing something about this question? Is it trickier than I'm giving it credit for? And believe it or not, I ended up spending the most time of any question on that easy question just because I was kind of expecting it to be a harder question than it actually was. So I'm really glad you asked this, Mumsy. The truth is the EA skews a bit easier in quant, which is to say, if you're seeing questions that feel a bit easy to you, I mean, be on your toes, make sure you're not misreading it or missing any trick, as I tried to do on that problem. But also remember that it's just not quite as hard as the GMAT in a lot of cases. Now, again, there are one or two questions on any given quant section that probably fit into that 700 to 800 level. The trick there is just don't give them too much time. Expect that there will be one or two such difficult questions. And when you see them, whether they be in the first half or the second half, say, ooh, you look harder than all the questions I've seen to this point. Skip ahead a little bit. Aha. And you look harder than all the questions that are to come. You're the hard question. Guess on it, bookmark it, use any extra time you have for that half section on that question. Make your, best shot at it, but don't let it take time away from other problems ever, because as we said on the IR section, that's the way to really do not great things on the test. Letting single hard questions that they just pepper in there on occasion derail your whole timing. All right. Now, Raj, I'll try to find a link to that. The EA website has a good site that tells you all of that. There are a lot that are accepting the EA. I usually, to remind myself of the site, just Google schools that accept or schools, as I did now, that's executive assessment. But it'll get you there, and I'm going to put it in the comments. If I can even comment, I don't know that I can. Huh. There must be a way. Oh well. I'll put it on screen at some point at the very end, but Google that. It's on the EA's website. And yeah, I'll share it with you if nothing else, and I'll show it to you at the end. Okay. All right. This is a good example of a critical reasoning question. So we said there are 3 types of questions on the verbal section: sentence correction, reading comprehension, critical reasoning. Reading comprehension is going to give you a long passage and usually 4 questions that one by one ask some stuff about that passage. Yeah, they do have a list on their website, and it's, again, an ever-growing list. This is critical reasoning, which will basically give you a short passage, usually more than a single sentence, so it's longer than sentence correction, but shorter than reading comprehension in all cases. And then they'll ask you a question about that, like what needs to be assumed in order to reach the conclusion above, which of the following, if true, would most strengthen the argument above, most weaken the argument above, stuff like that. And even though we're not going to get super involved with this question, the thing I want you to know about this question type is this. These arguments that they give you in critical reasoning, on first read, they might seem like pretty good arguments, pretty solid, airtight arguments. They never are, okay? The method in critical reasoning is, for most question types, read the arguments. Well, first read the question, figure out what your task is. Come up here and read the argument and try to find the conclusion of the argument. Sometimes that conclusion will be in the question itself. Right? That country N will succeed in its plan to reduce its dependence on foreign oil is the conclusion we want to, or is what we want to treat as the conclusion. Usually, though, the conclusion is part of the argument, the thing the argument wants to sell you on. So find that conclusion. Then identify the support that the argument has provided for that conclusion. And then ask yourself some version of this crucial question. What's missing? What other support should they have given me if they were really going to sell me on this conclusion? The big secret of critical reasoning for most of the question types in it is the arguments are made deliberately bad, okay? They feel kind of convincing initially, but when you really dig into them, the premises they offer, the reasoning they offer, never fully support the conclusion they're trying to convince you of. And the game in critical reasoning is to try to figure out the stuff that's not there in the argument, but should have been. Okay. And then the questions will ask you about that missing stuff in one way or another. Basically, what was assumed by the author of the argument, but not actually stated, right? What could be added to the argument to help it based on the things, the holes, the gaps the argument has left in it, right? The things that the argument failed to address. What could be added to fill that gap a little bit to strengthen the argument, or what could be used to exploit that gap in the argument to hurt the conclusion? Those are your kinds of tasks. Big thing I want you to take away about this question type is, even if the arguments seem pretty convincing, never take them as convincing. They're always missing information. Okay. All right. Now, for anybody wondering, by the way, especially if you're watching this online later and you had a chance to pause it and try this question, always trust Vamsi is the answer. D is exactly right. Nicely done, as usual. All right. Again, not getting too deep into this, but I wanted you to know what critical reasoning looked like and what roughly was going on in this question type. Well done. Now let's come back to the quant section. All right. We started on kind of an easier quant question, problem-solving question, not an easy one by any stretch. Thank you. GMAT Club, Abhijit comes through with the key link. Wish I knew how to comment, would have sent it. Really glad he is here. Thank you, sir. Take a look at this question. And again, I'm just going to give you a minute to familiarize yourself with it and at least start thinking about how you might approach it before we get into this one. Believe it or not, by the way, it is not D. All right. And while you guys are thinking about this, if you're watching it later online, pause it, work on it. In the meantime, I'm going to answer Wamsi's question. You're absolutely right. It is a personal preference thing. Some people find they have more success when they pre-think, and some people find that they have more success when they go straight to the answer choices. From a study perspective, I would recommend definitely working on pre-thinking as you're studying for it. But if by the time you're approaching test day, you're like, well, the pre-thinking never really leads to anything, I end up just having to go to the answer choices anyway when I'm successful, then that should be your strategy on test day. But when you're first studying critical reasoning, I think it tends to work better overall if you do that pre-thinking successfully. So you're trying to strengthen that skill as you're studying. Just at some point, if it's not really working for you, admit, all right, that's a losing battle, write that one off, and just start relying more and more on the answer choices as you get closer and closer to test day. All right. Hopefully, those of you who were getting involved with this question have had some time to look at it, get to know it, love it. Let's talk about it now. All right. What can we do on this question? So one of the things I stressed early on, and I'm coming back to it in a big way now, is that there is more than one way to solve these problems, right? The three kinds of approaches you can take usually to quant problems are algebraic approaches, numerical approaches, and conceptual approaches. All right. And they each have their advantages. They each have their disadvantages, or we'll call it logical approaches, logic-based stuff. Usually, logical approaches are going to be the fastest and most effective, but the drawback to logic-based approaches is they are the hardest to come up with. All right, truly. Algebraic approaches are going to feel the most familiar, especially if you remember math classes of old in which your math teacher very strongly encouraged you to use algebraic approaches on word problems, but they are often inefficient on these problems. Numerical approaches are often a pretty good middle ground. They give you a lot of concreteness and so are not as abstract as algebraic approaches, and sometimes therefore can be less error prone than algebraic approaches, but they can take more time, sometimes more time than algebraic approaches, certainly more time than logical approaches. All right. So pros and cons to each of these things. And a big part of the reason why my best piece of study advice on quant, aside from study those topics we saw earlier, is do problems in multiple ways the further you get into your study routine, is you want to be comfortable pivoting from one approach to the other, blending the two approaches, or just looking at a problem and knowing this approach is going to be the most efficient approach to the problem, right? And that's going to change. The type of approach that's the most efficient approach to any given problem is going to change from problem to problem. Navraj, you redeemed yourself. It is indeed 24. And I think you probably caught the kind of sneaky thing they do in this problem to make it 24 rather than 21. All right. One, it's that Yolanda is going to walk 21 miles. Bob's going to walk 24. And so if you just answer the wrong question, you can get in trouble that way. But another thing is this. You might notice a lot of numbers in this problem, right? There's 45, there's 3, there's 4, right? Numbers abound. But one of the numbers they do a pretty good job of hiding in this problem is the 1 at the very beginning. All right. They'll do that whenever they start off a sentence with a number. They'll never start off a sentence with an actual numeral. They will always, if they're going to start off a sentence with a number, write it as a word. That is their MO, right? And so sometimes they get sneaky advantages from that. Like it's easy to overlook that you have a number there. Okay. Now, what are the different ways we can do this? So let's look in an algebraic way first. Algebraically speaking, this is a rate problem, and we're given a total distance from X to Y of 45 miles. In a rate problem, when you're given an overall total of time or total distance or something like that, that's usually how you start framing the problem algebraically. You call that 45 miles your total distance. And so that 45 miles is going to be equal to the distance that Yolanda travels plus the distance that Bob travels. And it's worth noting that the question is asking for the distance that Bob travels anyway, right? That's what we're trying to get to in this problem. Again, really important because there is going to be a trap answer for the wrong question, Yolanda in this case. From there, we go to, well, what do we know about Bob and Yolanda in terms of the distance they walk? As most distance problems use the formula distance equals rate times time, what we're really looking for Bob and Yolanda is, do we know the rate at which they're walking and do we know the time at which they're walking? And this is how the algebra unfolds. Indeed, we do know something about these things, right? We know that Yolanda is walking 3 miles an hour, but we don't know her time. And we know that Bob is walking 4 miles an hour. So we'll call Yolanda's time t. All right. We know that Bob is walking 4 miles an hour. So we're going to replace his distance with a certain rate, 4 miles an hour in a certain time. We don't know his time either, but we do know that he starts walking 1 hour after Yolanda starts walking. And this is a tricky thing. This is part of the reason that the algebra is sometimes not the ideal way to go, because one false move in algebra and you're toast. Even though Bob starts walking 1 hour later, and it might feel a bit more natural to say time plus 1, that ends up meaning that he walks for 1 hour less than Yolanda does. Yolanda spends 1 more hour walking than Bob because she started earlier. So the time he spent walking, which is what t represents, is t minus 1. All right. If we get that set up, we should be in pretty good shape. I hope. I don't know. It's not looking good right now. 45 equals 3t plus 4t minus 4. And combine your like terms. Send that 4 over to the other side. You add the 4 to both sides. It becomes 49. Add the 3t and the 4t. You get 7t. And boom. Divide both sides by 7. T is 7 hours. Now be careful. Who's walking 7 hours? It's Yolanda, right? Yolanda was the one who was walking for t hours initially. Bob's walking for t minus 1 hours. And that's important because remember, we're looking for the distance Bob traveled, which is going to be his rate, 4 miles an hour, times the number of hours he spent walking, which is 1 hour fewer than Yolanda spent. And that's going to be 24 miles. All right? That's an algebraic approach to this problem. It's not so bad, but again, one false move and you're kind of finished on this problem. If you do t plus 1 for Bob instead of t minus 1, or if you do t minus 1 for Yolanda instead of t plus 1, you're in trouble. All right. And even getting it started can be pretty hard. Seeing that you set this up around the 45 total miles that they're traveling and set that equal to the distance Yolanda travels and the distance Bob travels, and then unpack the distance Yolanda travels into Yolanda's rate times Yolanda's time and the distance Bob travels into Bob's rate and Bob's time. And then keep in mind that you better be solving for the distance of Bob because the distance of Yolanda is very much among the answer choices. You can see that there's ample opportunity for mistake in the algebraic approach, right? But it will work and it can feel pretty clean and to the point, and it does get you to the correct answer of A if all the steps go according to plan. All right, that's cool. But what would we do if we wanted to do this one numerically? Because again, late stage studying, you do it algebraically, you're like, cool, good on me. Now let me expand my palette a little bit and see if I can do it numerically. In this case, the setup of the problem is such that you have got concrete numbers in the answer choices, and they actually represent something pretty useful. All right, come back to our numerical approach framework. All right, so algebra, check. We've done it. Numerically speaking, we can use these answer choices. These are all potential distances that Bob traveled, right? And especially knowing that Bob traveled 4 miles an hour, we might be inclined to test out an answer choice. That is easily going to go along with 4, right? So again, key things to testing out answer choices. We've got concrete numbers and they represent something useful in the problem, something that links up with other information. Bob's distance links up with Bob's speed to let us know that Bob would have walked for 6 hours, right? 24 miles divided by 4 miles an hour. Right. And again, I'd start with 24. Not usually. It's not usually a good idea to start with 8. It's usually a good idea to start somewhere in the middle of the answer choices. But because 24 here is the number that works far and away best with the 4 miles an hour that Bob goes, and because that's the number in the problem that the 24 links up with most directly, because they're both about Bob and things he did, start with 24. It shows the most promise. All right. Bob goes for 6 hours. And now the question is, okay, what does that lead us to next in the problem? How does knowing Bob's number of hours spent walking affect anything else? And indeed, we know that Bob starts walking 1 hour after Yolanda starts walking. So from there, we can say, okay, the time of Y, time of Yolanda is 7 hours. And then the question is, what does that link up to in a problem? What else do we know about Yolanda? We know only that she was walking 3 miles an hour, right? And of course, a time times a rate will give you a distance. Basically, if Bob's walking 24 miles and so 6 hours, Yolanda must be walking 7 hours, which means at her rate, she must have walked 21 miles. And this is the moment of truth. If all goes well, we've used every number in the problem besides 1, 45. If all goes well, where we're at now in terms of the numbers is going to match the other number, the last remaining number in the problem. And indeed it does. We started with 24 miles potentially for Bob. We find out if Bob goes 24 miles, Yolanda, just following the rules of the problem, must go 21 miles. And together, they have walked 20 or 45 miles. And notice, that's not necessarily a huge time saver. And there's some like logical pitfalls in there. Just we went out of order of the information in the problem. We had to go more logically, like Bob's miles combines with Bob's miles per hour to get Bob's time, which links up to Yolanda's time, which links up to Yolanda's miles per hour to give us Yolanda's miles, which combined with Bob miles gives us our 45 miles, right? But it doesn't require us to set up algebra. It doesn't require us to be super careful with the algebra either. And that's no bad thing, especially if you're not feeling particularly confident in your algebraic skills. And even if you are, you want to have options going into this. That is actually really, really interesting. The logic here probably has less to do with that because, in fact, I'm going to go with the logical approach right now. I think you might have gotten a bit lucky on that, but I'll talk to you about the logical approach right now. And I'm really glad you put it out there because, indeed, here's our logical approach. At long last. The logical approach here kind of dovetails nicely with the algebraic approach, actually. So we've seen algebra, check. We've seen the numerical approach, check. And now we're looking at the logical approach. The logical approach in a two-person rate problem like this will often go along these lines. Whenever Yolanda and Bob are walking together, they're going in opposite directions, right? One's coming from X to Y, right? Often logic is really good with a drawing. And one's going from Y to X, right? That's Bob going from Y to X at 4 miles per hour. And Yolanda going from X to Y at 3 miles per hour. And we're looking to figure out when they meet, which is to say when they cover the whole 45 miles that is between them initially, right? Okay, we know off the top that Yolanda walks 3 miles, right? And so in looking at this whole kind of like distance between them, we might say, all right, overall, there are 45 miles. But Yolanda walks 3 of those miles on her own before Bob even gets going, right? So that functionally speaking, if we just kind of lop that off the top, what they really have to cover collectively is 42 miles. Okay. Now, I say cover collectively because once Bob starts walking, think about it very concretely, right? If Yolanda in an hour covers 3 miles going towards Bob, but at the same time, in that same time period, Bob covers 4 miles going towards Yolanda, then collectively, they've covered 7 miles in that hour, right? They've erased 7 miles of the distance between them. They'll be together so soon, all right? They're going to love it. What that means is when they're both walking, collectively, they cover 7 miles an hour. All right, 7 miles per hour together. If we ignore Yolanda's 3 miles, or not ignore, but just account for Yolanda's 3 miles, then once Bob starts walking, they have 42 miles left to cover. And we can just ask ourselves, how many hours is it going to take them to cover those 42 miles if they've got a 7 mile an hour collective walking rate? It's going to take them 6 hours. And of course, if Bob is traveling for 6 hours, he's going to go 24 miles. All right. We didn't have to set up super complicated algebra there. We kind of shortcutted the algebra, and especially you didn't have to worry about the t+1 or t-1 or things like that, much less the like 45 equals distance of Yolanda plus distance of Bob. We just got to say, okay, let's take the 3 miles we know about off the top. It's 42 miles from then on. Let's think logically about how they're going to cover that distance between them, 3 plus 4 miles per hour at a time, and let's cover those 42 miles in that time. We get the number of hours they both spend walking together. And because they ask about Bob's distance, we can loop back around to Bob's 4 miles an hour times 6 hours equaling 24 miles. All right. Yeah, the already traveled for an hour is honestly the hardest part of this problem. Again, acknowledge what it is too. Part of it is it's at the very beginning of the problem and it's not a number. So if you've read the whole problem and then you're going to go back and work with information, that 1 hour is going to hide from you. If you take notes along the way in the problem, you might account for it, but even then it's hard to account for at the beginning. All right. So now let's get back to study process. What do we take away from this problem? One of the things I want you to take away is, again, 3 different ways to do this problem. And word problems in particular tend to be open to the greatest variety of approaches. So when you're studying word problems on your own, definitely push yourself on word problems to use different approaches. Okay. But you'll still get some wrong. And that's part of the study process. You should absolutely get stuff wrong. All right. So let's pivot a little bit right now to talk about what you should be doing on the review side of things. For this problem, for instance, you should spend more time reviewing than you spend actually doing a problem, right? Review the process as well as the content. Like, Vamsi, you obviously had a pretty good process that you're going into that problem with. You just missed a thing in that problem, right? And so it's not like the content was off, right? You know how to do distance, rate, and time problems, it seems. It was more a misread, right? Letting go of a fact that you were given in the problem. That was the issue that prevented you from successfully doing it that way in the problem. First step in reviewing is, if you get a problem wrong, just acknowledge what that is, really. Okay. First step in reviewing is try to redo the problem on times. Let me say that more clearly. All right. Your first step when you review a problem, do a set of problems, do it timed usually, but then come back and redo the problems. All right. It says review all questions. You should be redoing them first, redoing them on timed. If you got it right, then you're trying to redo it using a different kind of approach, right? It's pivoting to numerical or logical or algebraic. If you do it wrong, you're just trying anything you can to get through it. All right. But then you're trying to diagnose the errors, and the errors can be about the content. They can be about your process. They can be about your scratch work, about your reading. They could be a trap. Watch out for calling an error careless, because even if an error is careless, that doesn't mean that you should say, well, that's going to happen. Not much I can do about it. Don't be careless. What it really means is you've got to come up with some sort of intervention that's going to prevent that careless error from happening again. So we might call that missing the 1 hour thing a careless error, right? Totally fair. But what's a proactive takeaway we can get from that? That's what we're really looking for from each problem, right? We're looking to come away from the problems we do with advice to our future selves that is going to help on later problems. So the advice on that problem might not just it's a bit glib to say, read more carefully, be more careful, right? That's not going to be helpful advice for later problems. You already know to read carefully and be careful, right? It might instead be something a bit more specific, but not totally specific, like watch out for cases in which they write a number in words instead of as a numeral, right? Doesn't happen a lot, but the more you can acknowledge that that's specifically what happened here to get you down, the more you're going to be on your toes for that semi-specific thing. And notice that's not a takeaway that's tied to rate problems or meeting problems, two trains, X to Y problems. That's a problem that's a takeaway that's just more about word problems in general, right? And it can happen in any number of different kinds of word problems. Or it could be to expect that in a lot of rate problems, especially two-person rate problems like the Bob and Yolanda problem, that oftentimes one of the people will start before the other person. That is a pretty common feature in a two-person rate problem. And so next time you see a two-person rate problem, you'll say, okay, let me look to see if they're doing that in this problem, because you start creating expectations that are tied to certain problem types. That could kind of, in that sense, be a content takeaway, but it doesn't matter. As long as your takeaway is tied to a trigger, when to expect or look for a certain thing to prevent a mistake from happening again. Word problems, look for numbers written as words. And when they happen, just note them down, because otherwise they're easy to forget about. Or two-person rate problems, look for somebody to start earlier than the other person. That creates not only an expectation in the future, but a semi-specific circumstance, I should say, in which to have that expectation. And then the right thing to do, honestly, is, especially if you have, say, a GMAT official guide or something where you can look through a bunch of problems, go to some other problems of that type. Go to some other word problems or some other two-person race problems and try to see if you can spot that feature in those problems. In the official guide, for instance, right now, the current edition of the official guide, there's a problem about two truckers, Al and Ben. All right, somewhere in the first 100 problem-solving problems, I want to say it is. And it has that same thing happening. One of those truckers starts a few hours earlier than the other trucker. It doesn't have the thing written out in numerals, but it does have one person starting earlier than another. And going and finding that and seeing it there can kind of reinforce your expectation that that's going to be the case in a two-person problem. And that attunes you to that possibility more and more, so that rather than just being blindsided by it, you start getting in the habit of reading for it in that problem type. A lot of problem types come with their own specific kinds of traps. For instance, in fraction and percent word problems, they're always going to try to trick you about what total you're taking your fraction or percent of. That's a word trick, right? But the more you expect that and the more you tie it to fraction or percent word problems, the more you can be on your toes for that specific word trick when those problems come up, right? That's better as a takeaway than read carefully, which is totally non-specific and hard to employ, but it's not intimately tied to the individual question that generated the takeaway. It's got a bit wider applicability to questions of a certain type or questions of a certain look or something like that. That's the kind of takeaway you want when you're studying for these problems, okay? Make mistakes as you do these problems. Figure out which kinds of approaches, algebraic, numerical, or logical, lead to those mistakes more often. Shy away from those approaches or try to address those mistakes that you make in those approaches so you can have them at the ready, right? But yeah, it's really common. And I was in the same boat when I first started these tests years and years ago. I was in the same boat. I'd be like, oh, careless mistake, kick myself for it, say, well, it's going to happen sometimes, and move on. But the more proactive you can be about where that mistake happens and what the remedy might be, and often there's a scratch work remedy or something for it, that's good, because that's something you can do. And so repeat doing and turn into a habit, you can basically start to extirpate those careless mistakes that seem really, really hard to get at, okay? One thing about reviewing, and I know I kind of said this earlier, like redo a problem when you're first reviewing a problem. The converse to that is when you're reviewing problems, do not get in the habit of going straight to an explanation, because if you do that, you'll read the explanation, you'll be like, oh, I get it now. But two problems with that. One, it's much easier to read an explanation and get it than to do that same thing again in the future, right? And two, all explanations are going to be tied to the specific problems that they are written for, which means you're not necessarily extrapolating from an explanation to other problems of a similar type, right? You can go to explanations eventually, but put as much of the review process on yourself before you go to explanations, which is why you should end up spending at least twice as long reviewing a problem as doing it initially. All right, there's a lot to get out of it. There's a lot to do there. And the harder you make the review process on yourself, the more you hold yourself accountable to get through that review and find a way through the problem, the better you will get faster, even if it means you end up going through fewer problems overall. All right. Well, I'm seeing like excellent study question. What do you do if you only have a couple of weeks to study because you want to apply this cycle? There is fast track help available. I mean, most companies, ours included, Manhattan Prep, we do one-on-one tutoring. It can be kind of expensive, but it is often the fastest approach you have. However, this is one of the reasons that I put up that slide earlier about the different content types that are really important on the exam. What I would say is like, make sure you're taking practice tests, which I think you said you already have, right? And essentially make sure that you are ready for those question types. And now we know not only, content wise for these question types, especially the ones I've bracketed there in purple, but also knowing the traps, knowing different kinds of approaches to those problems, different ways they can get tested, what the conceptual version looks like, when numbers can help you, when algebra is the best way to go. Like basically double down on those majorly tested topics and then honestly just go for it. Bombed it like totally, or bombed it especially because of IR? All right, I'm going to put up some other review advice too while I'm investigating the situation. Because of IR. IR is, again, as I say, one of the hardest things to really handle as far as it goes. There's a lot of good advice for IR online, but there's also a lot of bad advice for IR online. One thing I can say is like, you need MSR to go well. And if that means you just need to do a lot of MSR practice, I'll sign off on that. Like, I think practice is about the only thing you can do in MSR, aside from going and like finding advice. But MSR tends to play out a lot like reading comprehension, and there's no really secret to or trick for it. You just have to do it well. But the other big advice in IR is make sure that you are prioritizing questions appropriately, right? And there's a hope that the more practice you do, the less anxious you will be. But I think that also knowing, what the different subtypes are in IR. And so having a strategy for like, I'm going to avoid the 2-part logic question and the table logic question. And I know what they look like and I'm ready for them. That can maybe at least help the whole thing feel more manageable, right? And having certain expectations for what to do in a math-based, easy-looking graphs question versus what to do in a more like logic type graph question, a flow chart or an organizational diagram or something like that. Just having expectations for not only the IR types, but the IR subtypes can really help. Okay. And you can get, good advice for that stuff online. But man, I wish, yeah. Best source for IR or any, like, you're right. There's not a lot of focus on IR, even by test prep services. We have an IR and essay book that we sell that's pretty okay. Like, it definitely tells you about the different IR types. But getting to know the different subtypes and stuff like that, that can be a little bit harder. You know what? I'm gonna put up my like email address at the end of this. And Vamsi, I totally encourage you and anybody watching this video, honestly, email me if you need some advice like that, because I've got good advice to give, but I don't necessarily know where it can easily be found online. That's the truth. And as I can't figure out the chat window, I'll put it up on screen when we close this presentation, which is gonna be happening here pretty soon, actually. But there are free resources out there. There are free sessions that you can find and watch even on YouTube and things like that. But you're right that they are few and far between. So email me and I will let you know whatever the best I can find is, or I'll just give you some hopefully good advice myself. Okay. Let's see. Any last thing to say? Only perhaps one last thing to say. And this is just based on a promise that I made earlier, that I'd talk a little bit about data sufficiency. Last thing I want to say is this whole you can do problems multiple ways thing tends to be a little more prominent as a study tactic and a little more obvious with problem solving questions, but it applies to data sufficiency questions too. All right. Looking at this one, a lot of people, when they first see this, go to the numerical approach. They start testing cases for the statements. They say, all right, I'm going to pick a number for y that's bigger than x and see what that means for my answer to the question. I'm going to pick a z that's bigger than x and see what that means as my answer to the question, right? But data sufficiency questions are also very open to algebraic approaches and even open to conceptual approaches. For instance, here, given that the most mathematically complex thing in this problem is the question itself, right? Where we have a lot of terms, a lot of like terms and stuff like that. Algebraically speaking, this question can be handled better than it can numerically speaking. You distribute the z to both of those things on the left and rewrite the question as having distributed the x to both things on the right. This. And then combine like terms. You can always do algebra on the question as long as you've got like an equation or something you can simplify up there. You are well within your rights to simplify. Subtract the xz from both sides. You've got is yz greater than xy. And even at that point, you can divide both sides by y. And the question, when approached algebraically, reduces down to is z greater than x, right? And if you have that, you don't have to pick any numbers in the statements anymore. Statement 2 clearly gives us information that will enable us to answer that question. Statement 1 does not. And for anybody who's totally unfamiliar with data sufficiency, I am sorry that I'm not giving you a rundown so much on how data sufficiency works, but there are plenty of resources for data sufficiency available for free online, and I highly encourage you to look them up. Conceptually speaking, you could also look at this, as some people do, and say, well, you know what? Because y is kind of the same inside the parentheses in both cases, and whatever's outside parentheses is getting distributed to both of these parts. What it really comes down to is whether this thing outside the parentheses is greater than that thing outside the parentheses. And it comes to the same question, is the z greater than the x? But you get there through a more logic-based approach, right? More conceptual, more of a like rules-based or just the way numbers in algebra work-based process, all right? 3 different approaches on this problem. Now, it looks pretty algebraic initially, and that's one of the reasons that algebra will probably work really well for it, right? But all 3 will work, and a big part of your studying and a big part of the reason why you want to do problems you get right in a second way afterwards is figure out which kind of approach works best for you and for any given problem and why. Reflect on that afterwards. Why does this one work best for algebra? It's because the question is very algebraic and there are lots of like terms up there. And as long as you come away with a takeaway like that, okay, if I see another data sufficiency problem in which the question stem is the most complicated part, I'm going to do algebra there. Or if I see another data sufficiency problem in which the information given to me is very largely algebraic, as opposed to things like x is a prime number or something like that, I'm going to tend more toward algebra than towards number testing. That's a good thing. That's a good takeaway. Yeah, the positive numbers constraint is only necessary for this step. You're really not allowed to divide both sides of the inequality by y unless you know that y is a positive number. It doesn't have to be an integer, but it does have to be a positive. All right. Yeah, B is totally right. All right. We're going to wrap it up now, but Navraj, I've seen your question. How can I improve in sentence correction? And the answer is 1, the single most important thing you can do in sentence correction to improve is get to know part of speech-wise the difference between a modifier, like a descriptive phrase, a descriptive clause, a descriptive verbal thing, like an ing verb used as a descriptor, things like that. Get to know the difference between that modifier stuff and the main stuff in the sentence, what we often call the core of the sentence: subject, verb, rest of the predicate. Because the better you get at that, the more you can get into the habit on sentence correction of doing at least one read of the sentence in which you totally ignore the modifiers and just look at the main parts of the sentence. That's going to help with some of the hard sentence structure questions. And the EA does like its sentence structure questions, okay? It's also the case that modifiers get tested pretty heavily and that they can just impede your view on other issues. For instance, verb tense issues, subject-verb agreement issues, parallelism issues, all get easier if you can recognize modifiers and temporarily eliminate them. Comparison issues are easier if you know how modifiers work. So my single best piece of advice for sentence correction, besides obviously practice it and get to know it that way, is get to know modifiers. All right. Other than that, get to know some of the other major topics. For the EA, parallelism and comparisons are the other kind of major topics that you want to get to know. And the last piece of advice I'll give on sentence correction is to get to know a topic. What that actually means is two things. One, know the process on the topic. Know what makes parallelism wrong and what makes it right. Know what makes a comparison wrong and what makes it right. That's usually the easier of the two things to know a topic. The other thing, though, is recognition. How do you even know that a comparison is what's being tested in this sentence and parallelism is what's being tested in that sentence, right? And that will change from topic to topic. If you email me, I can give you some good advice on that as well. But essentially, there are certain features that really tell you that this topic or that topic is being tested. For instance, for parallelism, it's certain keywords. And we saw in an earlier question, tells you parallelism is being tested in all likelihood, especially if there's a change after the and. Or, but. And bigger versions of that, like not only, but also, or either this or that. Getting to know those key words, getting to recognize them will help you get good at sentence correction. And one of the best ways to get good at recognizing them is once you've learned what the kind of key tells are for each of the major topics, especially if you have an official guide or just some, GMAT Club has tons of sentence corrections questions posted on it, right? Go through them looking for those keywords for parallelism. Does this one have it? Nope, not a parallelism question. I'm going to forget about this for now. Go on to the next one. Does that have the keywords? Yeah, I see an and there. And stuff seems to be changing after it. Cool, that's parallelism. Now let me get into my what's right and what's wrong mindset for parallelism. Working on recognition is one of the most important things to getting better at sentence correction, and it's the one that people tend to overlook the most, okay? And I agree with Vamsi as well, that you can make a lot of meaning in the EA's sentence correction especially, and I totally agree with that. The grammar may be a bit elusive, especially because, and this is, I think, not a pleasant truth, but GMAT has always deferred to American idioms, and American idioms are in a lot of respects different from Commonwealth idioms, different from British idioms or India English idioms or Jamaican English idioms or things like that. GMAT defers to American idioms. The problem here is the EA is even more idiom heavy than the GMAT, at least so it seems from the couple of times I've seen it. And that means that it disfavors people who don't necessarily have the same ear for American idioms as somebody who's, come up speaking totally American English. All right. That can be a big disadvantage, but there are ways around it. All right. I just want to be clear that one of the hardest things about sentence correction on the EA is it does seem to be very idiom heavy with respect to the GMAT, and it can be a hard thing to study for. Now, you can learn that stuff. You can find lists of idioms and get to know it. But the truth is, your best bet overall in sentence correction is get to know how to use meaning, as Vamsi says. Get to know how to use the major grammatical topics, modifiers, parallelism, comparisons especially, and structure. Try to use those things to your advantage as much as possible so that when you see an idiom being tested where they have like in versus on or, to versus of or some little word split like that, you can isolate it, ignore it as much as possible, focus on the other topics because you're pretty good on those, and not have it affect your performance. All right. Okay. With that, you guys, I will end this session. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your participation. Special shout out to Vamsi and Navraj. Loved your questions, loved your answers, and was happy to have you there. There is my email address on the screen. And I wish you all best of luck in your EA preparation. Do feel free to reach out if you have questions, need some advice, or links to resources that I might have at my disposal. I'm here to help. All right. And it was really great to have you. All right. Have a good day, night, and good luck yet again. Thank you.